Over the last few lectures, we've been looking at the writings of Karl Marx, who was writing in the second half of the 19th century. With communist revolutions in China and Russia in the early 20th century, it was expected that Marx's projected communist society would soon spread to other parts of the globe. But this did not happen. Social theorists in the 20th century began to pay attention to ideology and culture as a way of understanding why capitalist society was so resilient. One of the schools of thought to emerge in the early part of the 20th century was the Frankfurt School. Some of the main theorists involved with this school were Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno, who talked about culture industries. There was Jürgen Habermas, who worked in critical social theory. And there were Lukács and Marcuse, whose work focused on postmodern theory, among other things. One of the well-known theorists from this period was the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci, who was also in prison at the time for his work in the communist movement. Gramsci wrote about the concept of hegemony, and his work that was written in the 1920s was translated into English much later in the 1960s. There was also Louis Althusser, who was writing in the 60s about structural Marxist theory. One of the questions that both Althusser and Gramsci were both concerned with was the question of why do subordinate classes go along with the status quo? Why don't they revolt against class divisions? The answer they found was in state power and domination. Gramsci saw state power and domination in terms of the twin themes of coercion or violence, which he saw as state coercive power, and consent or ideology, which he saw as located within civil society, or the spontaneous consent of the people. Althusser theorized these as the repressive state apparatus, or the RSAs, which consisted of the army, the police, and the prisons, versus the ideological state apparatus, or the ISAs, consisting of religion, schools, and media. In reality, most of these institutions use a combination of coercion and consent. For example, the army demands cohesion and discipline by inculcating a certain ideology, although it mainly functions by repression. Likewise, the school uses methods of punishment, and culture relies on forms of censorship, although they are mostly about ideology. For Gramsci, coercion and consent come together to form what he calls hegemony. Hegemony is a form of rule in which subordinate groups consent to the exercise of power or domination. Gramsci uses the following metaphor. When the state trembled, a sturdy structure of civil society was at once revealed. The state was only an outer ditch, behind which there stood a powerful system of fortresses and earthworks. We can see this metaphor reflected in the following diagram, where the state is the larger circle, what Gramsci calls the outer ditch, and society is the black circle inside, which consists of the powerful system of fortresses and earthworks. Now we come to Althusser's notion of ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs. According to Althusser, the reproduction of labor power requires the submission to the ruling ideology. All classes must be steeped in ruling ideology in order for the system to function. Where do we learn the things that we know? We learn them through religion, through education, etc. Althusser traces the ISAs through the transition from feudal society to capitalist society. Under feudal society, there was just one dominant ISA, and that was the church, which combined religion, education, communication, and culture. This is what Gramsci refers to as the ecclesiastics. Under capitalist society, there are a range of ISAs. The main one for Althusser is schools, but there is also religion, media, and the family. What we have in these theories is a system of the reproduction of class relations. But where is the room for change? According to Althusser, ideology is unified behind the ruling ideology, which is the ideology of the ruling class. But it can also become the site of class struggle. As Althusser says, quote, "The resistance of the exploited classes is able to find means and occasions to express itself there." This idea is expressed more fully by Gramsci's notion of counter-hegemony. One example could be the teaching of American history, which is often told from the perspective of white settlers. Columbus is presented as a hero and founder of America, while the founding fathers are seen as representing the nation as a whole. This often omits the crimes and cruelties committed against indigenous people, slaves, and of conquest and genocide in the name of progress. One example of a counter-hegemonic movement in education could be the movement of Black history or Indigenous immersion schools.